Okay, Zat Hashem, today is an exciting day. We're starting the third parak in Masechet Shabbat. I'm in Vav Mud Bet, the top of the page. Kira she'esikua bekashu b'gvava. We're going to have two sections in today's learning. Zat Hashem, we'll have the Mishnah, and then we'll have the Gemara, which discusses the Mishnah and understands in two possible different ways. Before we start this parak, there is some introductions that need to be made. Bezat Hashem, Hashem should give us the koach, the understanding, to master these halachot, because this is a little bit complicated. So, let's see. We know later on Daf Ayin Gimel, there's a list of the avot melachot, the primary melachot of Shabbat. Now, one of those melachot that are listed there is afiyah, which is baking. But it's a little bit misleading, actually, because really, baking, you think of baking bread in an oven, right? You think of, but it's not dafka baking. The Yisur Melacha on Shabbat is using heat to improve some food. That could be through hot water, bishul. Well, let's just stick with this for a second. Meaning the point is, it doesn't dafka have to be bread in an oven, like a baking process. Bishul is also included in the Av Melacha. So we're going to talk about bishul in our Mishnah, but really it's the same thing. Happens to be in the list of the avot melachot there, it says baking, but it means also bishul is included. So really bishul is afiyah, it's included. Now, when we talk about an oven, there's different types of ovens in the times of Chazal. One of them is called kira, which we're going to talk about in our Mishnah, but there's also other types of ovens. One of them is called tanur, and there's an important difference between them, which I'm not going to talk about tanur now because we're not learning about that. But the important difference between them is the kira didn't usually get as hot as the tanur. And actually, practically speaking, it appears to be modern day poskim say our ovens are more similar to kira and not as much similar to the other types of ovens like tanur. Very interesting thing. But what was a kira? So a kira was a rectangle-like oven, like a rectangle. It had two places on top of it you could put food to cook, and the fuel was at the bottom. The fuel, we're going to see there was different types of fuel they would use. You could either put it hanging over the coals, or on the coals, or on the edge of the oven on top, on the stove top as well.
It depends how much you want to use the heat.
Exactly. But the fuel is in the bottom.
Temperature, basically.
Exactly. Now,
it's like a barbecue just covered?
Yeah, but I'm going to say like a rectangle with two holes in the top. You could put the pot inside, farther down, higher up. So now, what we have over here is the following. In terms of Hilchot Shabbat Midaoraita, what is cooking? Again, it's taking something, let's say it's not fully processed, putting it on fire, and then that becomes fully processed on Shabbat. That's an Yisur Deoraita, no question. But then we have two processes which are called Shehiyah and Chazara, which should not be Asur Deoraita. You have a cooked food, and you want to leave that cooked food on the oven before Shabbat, going into Shabbat. Now, L'chaora, it really shouldn't be a problem, Midaoraita, because if it's cooked, you're not improving it, you're just leaving it on the fire. So L'chaora, it shouldn't be a problem. Similarly with Chazara, so Sheyah means to leave it on. You're leaving it on from before Shabbat. Midaoraita, it shouldn't be an issue. Chazara also. Chazara means you take it off the pot on Shabbat. You want to put it back on the fire on Shabbat. Again, it's fully cooked. You're not going to recook it on Shabbat. So it shouldn't be a problem. L'chaora midaoraita. This gets into a distinction.
What's the difference between Sheyah and Chazara?
Sheyah means leaving it on the fire before Shabbat, and then going into Shabbat on the fire. Chazara means taking it off on Shabbat and putting it back on. Now again, on a deoraita level, it shouldn't be a problem. Now with Chazara, there is a difference I want to point out between davar yavesh, davar lach. Maybe midaoraita it would be a problem with davar lach, but let's just stick with davar yavesh. It's not a problem midaoraita. So came along the Chachamim, and the Chachamim understood, which we'll see in the Mishnah, is these two processes of Shehiyah and Chazara could present two potential problems. Problem number one, which we've already spoken, is the issue of Shem Yechateh. Shemi Yechateh means is that if you leave it on the fire before Shabbat, or you return it to the fire on Shabbat, either way, it might have cooled off already, and then you might stir the coals that are underneath the kira at the bottom in order to make it hotter, and that could be a potential issue of havara, of actually lighting up a fire, and that would be an Isur D'Oraita. So one potential issue is Shemi Yechateh. The other potential issue is Michzikim Mevashel. Maze Michzikim Mevashel. It looks like you're cooking. But exactly, but what does it mean? Somebody might not realize that this isn't, it's already cooked and it's not really doing, and then they might think you're actually allowed to cook. So it presents, like Marat Ayin you could call it, that someone make a mistake in the future. Now which one of these, let's be clear about this, Shiyah or Chazara, which one sounds more problematic? More of a Chazara. Why is Chazara? Because Shiyah, you're leaving it on before. You might have the issue of Shemi Yechateh, but really Michzikim Mevashel, it's not as much of an issue. You see it on before. And Chazara, there's more of an issue also because once you take it off the fire, it cools down. If it cools down, when you put it back on, it's much more likely there's this issue of Shemi Yechateh, Michzikim Mevashel.
Let's say you took it off and there is
it
gas.
will tend to have much more of a problem than Shiyah. Okay.
Michzikim Mevashel, and also it can end up in Shemi Yechateh.
That's two issues, exactly. Two problems, okay? But I'm just pointing out is the issue of Chazara should be more problematic than Shihiyah, l'chaora. Okay. So the Chachamim came along and they said, if you want to do Chazal, now we're going to see it's a machloket in a minute, but these two processes, there's a trick or a loophole that you could do to avoid the issues of Shemi Yechateh or Michzikim Mevashel. What is the loopholes? Gufa or Ketuma? And we've spoken about this also. Now what is Gufa?
It's ashes on top of the hole on top of
Ketuma. That's Ketuma. So Gufa is that you remove the ashes. Scrape out the ashes. Exactly. Gufa. Yeah. You remove the ashes. Exactly. Gufa is, there's those coals at the bottom of the kira. If you remove it before Shabbat, so then you're not going to have an issue of Shemi Yechateh because they're not there. Or Michzikim Mevashel because they're not there.
Preserve the heat.
And then there's some heat that still remains, but it's not going to be an issue of Shemi Yechateh. Hatmana is a different, we're going to get to Hatmana later. That's a different discussion.
Heat, no?
I hear. Let's go back. Tuma is that you cover the ashes, the coals at the bottom, with cold ashes. And when you cover with cold ashes, it lowers the temperature. Now I'm going to tell you how Rashi learns. We see the Mishnah. Meaning it doesn't increase. It's not Mosif Hevel. That's how Rashi is going to learn here. I'll explain to you Rashi when we see the Mishnah. But these are the two ways you could potentially avoid the problem of Shiyah, the problem of Chazara, which is either removing the ashes before Shabbat or covering the ashes before Shabbat with cold efer, with cold dust or cold ashes, so that it doesn't undergo a process on Shabbat, perhaps of increasing the heat.
It's decreased the process.
However, what I just told you is really based on a machloket Tanaim, which is a machloket that is nogea until modern day poskim. Chananya v'chachamim. Chananya is of the opinion that this idea of Gufa and Ketuma is only necessary for Chazara. Which means, if you have something that's Ma'achal ben Drusai, that it's cooked, like we learned, Rashi said a third, Rambam said half, but it's what's considered, at least halachically, let's say, cooked. So Chananya says, Shihiyah is not a problem. You don't need Gufa and Ketuma to do Shihiyah.
You don't need
זה לא בעיה. כל העניין של גופה וכתומה זה לא שייך לשהייה. To leave it on, that's what Chananya's shita is. Chananya says, that in order to do shihiyah, you don't even need gufa and ketuma. It's not necessary. But
there is an opinion of...
One second. But to do chazara, says Chananya, that's where you need gufa and ketuma. The Chachamim hold, with both of them, you need gufa and ketuma. Means this takana that Chazal made, that there's a be'etzem, there's a gzeira. But in order to avoid the gzeira, you do gufa and ketuma. Chachamim hold, that's nogeh to both shihiyah and chazara. Chananya says, only shayach to chazara. Shihiyah you could do without doing gufa and ketuma, we're not worried about it. Now we're going to learn a Mishnah, and we're going to try to say, does this Mishnah fit with the Chachamim? Or does this Mishnah fit with Hananya? And we're going to learn this again. Actually, we quoted this briefly earlier in the Masechta, but Be'ezat Hashem, let's see this inside now. A lot of information.
Just the introduction.
Just a lot of information here, but I think as we go through, it'll become. Everybody get the word. That's really the key here. Is the words. I want everybody to be familiar. Gufa is scraping out the oven. Tuma is covering the ashes. And there is this machloket in the Masechta. Hananya holds you need gufa tuma for chazara, but sheyeh you don't need it. Leave it on before. It's not a problem. Hachamim say for both you need gufa tuma. To avoid
in Chazara, from what I understand, there is also a potential for Shema Echateh.
Exactly.
So what's the difference? The only difference is
a different process. Yeah.
The only difference is in Sheyah that you left it maybe audio, in Chazara that you bring it back.
100%. But Chazara is more concerning actually.
Obviously.
That's what we're going to see.
There is still a potential for both, for Shema Echateh.
Yeah.
Okay.
בסדר. Zat Hashem, let's get started.
Yalla.
Shem Hashem, Naseh v'natzliach. Says the Mishnah, Kira, a stove. Again, it's a double stove with the coals at the bottom. She'sikua bekash u'bigvava. So like this. And we're going to learn like Rashi. I'll tell you what the other Rishonim say, but we'll be'etzim stick with Rashi. She'sikua, that you used fuel, you heated it up. Bekash u'bigvava. Kash is straw and givava is stubble. In English it's called. The Mefarshim say the difference is kash is the part of the fuah, the grain,
like the
that's
hay,
connected to the ochel, the edible part, and gvava is what's connected to the ground that you leave in the ground. But they're both not edible parts of the grain that they also used to use as fuel. Okay? Notnim alea tavshil. I'm going to learn the Mishnah kipshuta, like simple, and then we'll see the Gemara. There's two ways to learn. Are we talking about shehiyah or chazara? Is it like Chachamim or like Hananya? It's going to be a little confusing. We'll see. So says the Mishnah, Notnim alea tavshil. You could put on it a tavshil, which means if the oven is heated with kash and gvava, you're allowed to put food on that oven. It's not a problem.
It's not even cold.
Now, I want to point something out. Rashi learns, why are you don't have to do gufa uktuma. Why don't you have to do gufa uktuma?
Because it's not cold.
So it turns in, so Rashi learns because it's not mosif hevel. These types of fuels don't add so much heat. Other Rishonim learn that these fuels don't turn into gechalim. They don't turn into coals. Okay, but Rashi learns it's not mosif hevel, it doesn't increase heat, and therefore you don't even need gufa uktuma. You can have these foods on these stoves if it's fueled by kash and gvava. However, begefet uveitzim, gefet Rashi learns is the leftover parts of the fruit, whether it's sesame or olives, after you squeeze out the oil, so they would use the leftover part for fuel, or wood. So lo yiten, you're not allowed to put food on those ovens, ad sheyigrof, unless you scrape out the coals, or ad sheyiten et ha'efer, or you put cold ashes over the coals to cool it down. Now here's where Rashi says, why? Mishum de mosif hevel. Because this type of fuel adds heat. It adds heat. Let's leave out the word hatmana for now, because it's not exactly hatmana. We'll get to that later. These would be mosif hevel. So therefore, in order to avoid being mosif hevel, adding heat, you have to either scrape out the coals, or cover them with something cold. Other Mefarshim learn, other Rishonim learn, these become gechalim, versus the first thing, kashuv gvava, they don't become gechalim, it just like burns up. That's other Mefarshim learn. But Rashi learns that those are not mosif hevel, these are mosif hevel, so therefore you need, for gufa uktuma, in order to put food on these types of ovens that are heated by gefet or eitzim.
But is it
okay? That's part one of the Mishnah.
It applies also for mevushal kol zorko, because mevushal kol zorko, what's the benefit of?
Exactly, because again, gzera shami echateh, mechziki mevashel. These are different gzerot. You're right. If it's not mevushal kol zorko, it's a different issue. Well, even if it's mevushal kol zorko, you still have a shami echateh. You'll stir the coals. If you stir the coals, that's havara. You're increasing the fire. That's a different issue. Now I want to write out the Mishnah as we go through it, because in the Gemara we're going to have two different ways of reading the Mishnah. Okay? So we have first part of the Mishnah. Let me erase this 1 second. Tissue, somebody?
I can get you.
Yeah,
okay. Wait.
Let me erase this because we don't need all of this right now.
Yeah.
What's that? Oh, it's helpful, Baruch Hashem. Just I want to put out the Mishnah here so we have it in front of our face. Toda. Let's see. Let me just erase this. Let's do like this.
Where are we? Kirash Yisikoy.
We just did the first part of the Mishnah. So we have like this. A is the first section of the Mishnah. We're going to have three parts, A, B, and C. So the first part of the Mishnah says that if it's heated up with kashu v'gava,
Mutar.
mutar. But we said if it's heated up with gefet
Gefet
ve'itzim,
ve'itzim.
let me just put this in, gefet ve'itzim, asur. Okay, that's A.
Why A?
First part of the Mishnah. We're going to have three parts. That's going to be what's more important, really. We'll see. We'll see in the Gemara. The first part of the Mishnah says if it's heated up with gefet or itzim, asur, ad...
Oh, because it doesn't even turn to coals.
Sheigof or iktom. Let's just put it like that. Means you have to do gufa or ktuma. Okay? That's the first step of the Mishnah. Gefet ve'itzim, it's asur to put it on the fire unless you do gufa or ktuma. That's what we said, the first part of the Mishnah. We said, Rashi says, because these things are mosif hevel, other mefarshim learn it turns into coals, and that would be an issue of shami echateh. B, let's move on. Second part of the Mishnah. Beit Shammai Omrim, Beit Shammai say, chamin avalot tavshil. Now, what does it mean? When are you allowed to use the kula, the tikkun of grufa uktuma?
When it's already boiled?
Only if it's chamin. Chamin means mayim chamin.
Okay.
Meaning only hot water. But if it's tavshil, if it's a cooked dish, food, even grufa uktuma doesn't help you. Okay? That's Beit Shammai. Ubeit Hillel omrim chamin v'tavshil. Beit Hillel says whether it's hot water or cooked food, grufa uktuma is a usable strategy. It's good. You can use it. Okay, so let's put this in now. So B is, when can you use gufa uktuma?
Water, but not a ship.
Beit Shammai says rak mayim, and Beit Hillel says afilu tavshil. Now that means when gufa uktuma is usable, gufa uktuma. So Beit Shammai says rak b'mayim, Beit Hillel says afilu b'tavshil. Now, let's stop for a second. You'll note,
not allowed.
I'm not being clear if we're talking about doing shiyar or chazara. There's two ways to read this Mishnah. We'll get to that in the Gemara. But what would be the logical difference between mayim and tavshil?
There is no process. Mayim, you turn them, they cold or hot. That's it. There is no any additional process to the mayim. Food, you end up cooking it,
This is already cooked. The water's hot and the food is cooked. So what's the difference according to Beit Shammai? Beit Hillel says it's the same. You can use gufa uktuma for both. But what's the chiluk according to Beit Shammai? So Rashi explains, you can use the hot water if you did gufa uktuma. He says, firstly, with hot water, there's no reason you would stir up the coals because it's already cooked. So we're not worried shemi echateh. Avalole tavshil, says Rashi, meaning with food, let's say cooked food, even if it's fully cooked, if it stews for longer, meaning if it continues to cook, it improves it. It's like a stew. You put it in the oven.
End up
like a cholent. Shemi echateh. Now, you have to point out of here, what do you mean shemi echateh? If you did tuma, grufa slicha, so then, we're talking about if you did grufa, right? That Beit Shammai says it still wouldn't be acceptable to use gufa because shemi yechateh. But if you did gufa, what's gufa? Taking out the coals. So what do you mean shemi yechateh by cooked food?
The question is
1 second. Evanta ma ani shalti?
If there is no coals anymore.
What's Beit Shammai saying?
Maybe you just put the coal on the side. It's still there and you push it back.
So the Mefarshim speak out in Rashi. What he's saying over here, va'atilach tuyeh, means you might have forgotten some. Even though you scooped it out, there's a chance you forgot some, and then you'll end up moving it. But either way, According to Beit Shammai, if it's water, there's no significant change or improvement. Mela, we're not worried you're going to stir it. Food, which could be improved still to some degree, we're worried Shemi Yechateh, so you can't use Gufa Uktuma as a tikkun. Rashi says further, Inami nitkaima machshavto umichsi kimevashel. This is where he throws that in. He says, it looks more like cooking by food versus water. So Memele, there's more of an issue of bishul, the gzera, the Rabbanan, you can't use Gufa Uktuma according to Beit Shammai. Now Beit Hillel disagrees. Beit Hillel says no. Even by Tavshil, it's going to be permitted
because you already clean up the coals.
Exactly. So therefore Beit Hillel argues. That's part B. C, let's go ahead. Now this is the third part of the Mishnah. Another machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai omrim notlin avelo machzirin. Now this we're going to have to focus in on the Gemara. Beit Shammai says you could take something off the fire on Shabbat, but you can't return it to the fire on Shabbat.
So there is no chazara.
Seemingly. Beit Hillel omrim af machzir. Beit Hillel says, as long as you did Gufa Uktuma, you could even return something to the fire on Shabbat. So C is, when are you allowed to use Gufa Uktuma? So Beit Shammai says, en machzirin. And Beit Hillel says, ken machzirin. Now let's run through the Mishnah outside and then we'll see the Gemara. We have 3 sections in the Mishnah. The first part of the Mishnah says, if you have an oven that's heated by gefet or eitzim, so the only way you're allowed to put food, now I'm saying put food, it might be chazara, it might be shiyah, we'll have to see what it is in the Gemara. The only way you're allowed to is if you do Gufa Uktuma, which means, because Rashi says it's mosif heat, exactly. But if you do Gufa Uktuma, you don't have to worry about that. The second part of the Mishnah says, when are you allowed to use this tikkun, this takana of Gufa Uktuma? Beit Shammai says only if it's hot water. Beit Hillel says even if it's food. Because you did Gufa Uktuma, so we're not worried about...
worry about if you have leftover coil over there. That's right.
Exactly, because you might end up stirring it, or Michzikim Vashel. Either way.
No problem.
But Mayim, you don't have that issue. It's not Michzikim Vashel.
So I have 2 reasons for to prohibit it, to put the cooked machal, mushal. Either it's...
Shemi Yechateh.
And
Michzikim Vashel. Exactly. And Beit Hillel says, no, you did the tikkun of Gufa Uktuma, you can even have cooked food there on the oven.
But according to Beit Shammai, if I need the water, okay, and I need them hot, then it's not so hot.
It's hot already.
Where is the problem of Shemi Yechateh? כן, אבל אומרים לך בתבשיל אסור ומים מותר.
כתבשיל...
Okay, but I need the water hot.
It's not significant, I guess. Not
לא 100% חם.
כן. It's not significant. It's like Yochanan is the issue with the coffee here. I hear what you're saying, shomea. But the point is, with water, it's less of a concern. It's not something objectively people... What the whole issue of Shema, Michzikim Vashel...
כן, אבל you either put it on the קירה או לא.
The water does not significantly improve. The more you leave water on the heat, it doesn't get better and better and better. It's hot, it's already hot. Period. Weiter. Food, it does get better. Like stew, it gets softer and nicer, etc. More of a chashash. Okay. And then the third part of our Mishnah, we have a machloket that Beit Shammai seems to say across the board, ein machzirin. You could take off the fire, not put back on the fire. And Beit Hillel says af machzirin. So this is obviously now, what are we going to do? We're going to look in the Gemara, we're going to say, wait a second. We know there's a machloket Tanaim regarding this inyan. That according to the Chachamim, in order to do even Shiyah before Shabbat, the oven has to have been Gufa Uktuma. It has to have been used the Tikkun. Hananya says you only need that for Chazara, but for Shiyah you don't need that. So which way does the Mishnah imply?
Shiyah before Shabbat, obviously.
Ken, Lefnei Shabbat, Shiyah. So now we're going to say, wait a second. Which of the 2 Tanaim seems to be more mashma in the Mishnah?
2 Tanaim?
Chananya v'chachamim. Because again, according to Chananya, the only necessity, the tzorech of Gufa Uktuma is only for Chazara. But for Shihiyah, you don't even need Gufa Uktuma. Chananya.
How we know?
We learned earlier and we're going to learn later. This is throughout the Masechah.
Chananya is not with the Korban
Midbanu al Enyan. Midbanu al Enyan, exactly. That's where he brought it up. Everybody brought the Enyan. As long as it was Ma'achal ben Drusai, so then Shiyah, you don't even need Gufa Uktuma. But for Yeah.
Hanania,
Here, let me put it here.
permit
Let me put it here. 1 second.
to do שהייה וחזרה.
Let me put here 1 second on the side. Let's put like this.
If you permit to do שהייה וחזרה.
צורך על גופה וכתומה. Which is, according to Hanania,
מותר?
רק בחזרה. According to the Chachamim,
גם בהטמנה.
אפילו
בהשעיה.
בשהייה. Okay, that's the machloket. According to Hanania, b'shehiyah you don't need gufa uktuma to leave it on the oven
So
before.
it's even more מקל than בית
But I want to point again where it's ma'achal ben drusai. It's important to note, meaning where it's ma'achal ben drusai and you put it on the oven before Shabbat, you don't need gufa uktuma. According to Chachamim, even for shehiyah you need gufa uktuma in order to leave it on before
even for
Shabbat.
שהייה?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now let's look. You want to listen before we do a little practice exercise over here. If you look at this Mishnah, you look at the Mishnah. Which of the two of these Tanaim does the Mishnah seem to imply more? Meaning the Mishnah is a little bit unclear in the beginning.
חנניה זה תנא?
Lo yiten. Maza lo yiten. Does it mean lo yishhe, like you can't leave it before Shabbat, or does it mean lo yachzir? You understand? There's two ways to read that in. Lo yiten means not to put, but what does it mean not to put?
Maybe it depends by the item.
So let's start with the Chachamim. Let's just speak this out outside, and then we'll look and see if it flows. According to the Chachamim, how would you read the Mishnah? Again, only gufa uktuma is needed when, according to Chachamim, even for shehiyah. So how would you start off? Lo yiten, you're not allowed.
Again.
According to the Chachamim, gufa uktuma is necessary even for shehiyah, not just for chazara. But even for shehiyah, you need to do gufa uktuma to put before Shabbat. So let's start off. If the oven is heated by gefet and eitzim, it's mosif hevel, asur ad sheyigrom o yiktom, and until you do gufa uktuma. So according to the Chachamim, what is that talking about?
רגע. אסור או מותר?
It's asur unless you do gufa uktuma. You need to do gufa uktuma.
אם זה גפת
Gefet ve'eitzim.
I was thinking it is אסור.
Not asur,
Because
ad
it turns to cold.
ad sheyigrof ad sheyiktom.
Okay.
Now, according to the Chachamim, what is that talking about? Afilu shehiyah.
No.
Okay, so according to the Chacham, let's put it back in the Mishnah. You're not allowed to do shehiyah if it's an oven. Let's say Rashi learns that's mosif hevel, unless you did gufa uktuma. Good. Kol sheken for chazara. Kol sheken you would need to
Because
do.
שהייה is more lenient.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on to the next section. In regards to shehiyah, gufa uktuma, what types of foods do you need to do shehiyah? So according to Beit Shammai, you're only allowed to do the shehiyah with mayim. Beit Hillel, even with other food. So far, so good. We're talking about shehiyah. Okay?
Now we're talking about chazara.
Now we're talking about chazara. Beit Shammai says, by the way, ein machzirin. Beit Hillel says, not only can you use gufa uktuma for
שהייה.
but even for the Chachamim flows beautiful. And by the way, Chachamim hold like Beit Hillel, that you can even use gufa uktuma for chazara. Yochai, you with me?
Okay.
That's beautiful. So far, so good.
So Hanania is מקל about
One
שהייה.
second, that's Chachamim. Now let's look how Hananya would fit in the Mishnah. Hananya holds Shia, there's no issue of gufa uktuma. So the only way you could start off the Mishnah according to Hananya is
It's not even implicated for
what is gufa uktuma we're talking
For
about? Chazara. Okay, let's put it back in the Mishnah. When do you need gufa uktuma? Chazara. So asur lachzir. You're not allowed to
עד שיגרוף
return
ויקטום.
ad shigof v'yiktom. Exactly. Okay.
כהשעיה אין בעיה.
That's the first part of the Mishnah.
Hananya.
No, that's so far so good.
לא, ורבי חנניה, השעיה אין בעיה לפני שבת.
Exactly. You don't even need gufa uktuma. So the only way to plug it into the Mishnah is, in order to do chazara, you need to do gufa uktuma before returning it. Meaning, before Shabbat you do gufa uktuma, then on Shabbat you can put it back. Fine. Gufa uktuma, when is it necessary for chazara? So Beit Shammai says for only allowed for hot water. Beit Hillel says for chazara you can even use gufa uktuma for a tavshil. But then the kasha the Gemara is going to ask
Then
is,
אין מחזירים.
what do you need the seifa, the third part of the Mishnah? The third part of the Mishnah, Beit Shammai says you can't do chazara. Beit Hillel says you could. We already said that. Meaning, based on the second part of the Mishnah, we're only talking about chazara. So the Gemara is going to ask, Lefi Hananya, that's going to be the kasha. We'll read it in now. The third part of the Mishnah is completely not necessary. See, according to the Chachamim, it was time at Shiyah, Chazara. According to Hananya, Chazara, not necessary. That's going to be the kasha. And then it's a raya, because this is actually Machloket Tanaim, and our Mishnah seems to support the Chachamim. Beautiful. Let's read that inside now. Says the Gemara, Ibailu. So the Chachamim in the Beit Midrash asked the following question. Haylo yitain. When it says in the Mishnah, again, you're not allowed to put food if the oven is heated with gefet or itzim, ad sheyigrof or ad sheyitain et ha'efer. What does that mean? Does it mean lo yachzirhu? You can't do chazara. But if you were leaving it on before Shabbat, you don't need to do gufa uktuma. Umani, and who would the Mishnah be like? Chananya. It's Chananya. Meaning one way to learn the Mishnah, it's Chananya. Lo yiten means you can't do chazara, but sheya you could do without gufa uktuma. It's not a problem. Tanya, where do we know that there's this position of Chananya? Chananya omer kol shu k'ma'achal ben drusa. As long as it was either a third cooked or a half cooked, that's Rashi and the Rambam. Mutar le'she'oto al gabe kira. You're allowed to leave it on the fire. Afal pi she'eno gavu ve'eno katum. That's the shita of Chananya. She'iyah does not require gufa uktuma. That's option number 1 in the Mishnah. Odilma. Or perhaps the way you read the Mishnah, lo yiten means, when do you need gufa uktuma? Lishhotnan. It means even to do shiyah you need gufa uktuma. V'igarof v'katum. And if it was scraped out or covered the ashes, it's mutar to do shiyah. V'ilolo. But if not, it wouldn't be permitted to do shiyah. V'kol sheken lachzir. And certainly you need gufa uktuma to do chazara, to return it. And this would not be like Hananya. This would be like the shita of the Chachamim. Everybody with the question? There's 2 ways to look at the Mishnah.
It's either we're talking about Shiyah or we're talking about Chazara.
Exactly. So the first way we understand is, Lo yiten, you're not allowed to put the food on the oven unless you do gufa uktuma. Like Hananya, you can't do Chazara. But Shiyah, you don't even need gufa uktuma. The other option is, option number 2, is Lo yiten means you can't leave it before Shabbat unless you did gufa uktuma, and kol sheken, to return it on Shabbat wouldn't be mutar unless you did gufa uktuma, which is like the Chachamim, not like Hananya. 2 ways to look at the Mishnah.
But ma'achal ben drusa, we're talking about, it's only for a specific type of people that they're eating the food in this time.
We're allowed to use that because it's not for them. We're using their geder for ourselves. That's considered cooked.
So everyone is ganavim? Or everyone is
okay, that's an interesting question, but that's the geder Chazal gave us. Okay. So Tashma, let's look at the Mishnah and try to figure out which way reads better in the Mishnah. We have 2 cases, which is really B and C that we listed here, where there's a machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. 2 machloket. So let's put this in. The first machloket, which was the second section of the Mishnah, B, we said like this. Beit Shammai omrim, Beit Shammai say, when do you need gufa uktuma? Chamin. You could only use gufa uktuma for hot water. Avalot tavshil. But you can't use gufa uktuma if it's for food. We said again, either shami echateh, mirsi kimevashil. Beit Hillel omrim chamin v'tavshil. Beit Hillel says, even whether it's chamin or tavshil, it's permitted. That's the second machloket, the second part of our Mishnah. And then the second machloket, which was C of our Mishnah, Beit Shammai omrim notlin avalo machzirin. Beit Shammai says you could take it off the fire on Shabbat but not return it. Beit Hillel omrim af machzirin. That was the C, the third part of our Mishnah. Okay, so let's look at these now. If you want to learn that the first part of our Mishnah was talking about Shiyah and Kol Sheken Chazara, which is like the Chachamim. So then, Hachikatani, this is how you'd read the entire Mishnah. Baruch Hashem, the Gemara lays it out for us beautifully. This is how you'd read the Mishnah like the Chachamim. Let's go through it slow. A, this is the first part of our Mishnah. Kira she'isikua bekash uvigvava. If the oven was heated up with straw or stubble, which Rashi learns are not mosif hevel, or others learn don't turn into gechalim. So then, what does it mean lo yiten? Or yiten, I should say. Yiten is mashhina le'a tavshil. That, it doesn't mosif hevel, so you could leave it on before Shabbat. You don't even need gufa uktuma. That everybody agrees. Begefet uveitzim, but if it was heated up with gefet or itzim, which are mosif hevel, they add. So then, lo yisheh ad she'igrof ad she'yiten efer. Even for Shiyah. This is the Chachamim are going to learn. Since it's Mosif Hevel, or it turns into coals like other Rishonim learn, therefore, you can't leave it on the fire before Shabbat, the food on the fire, unless you scrape it out, or to put coals, cold ashes to lower the flame. That's A of the Mishnah. Umahen mashin, and that there's a machloket. What are you allowed to leave on the fire before Shabbat? This is part B of the Mishnah. Bet Shammai omrim chamin avalot tavshil, uBeit Hillel omrim chamin v'tavshil. It's a machloket. What are you allowed to do shiyah with? Beit Shammai says only hot water and not cooked foods. Again, shemi yichater or michzikim evashel. And Beit Hillel says even cooked foods because you did gufa uktuma, so it's mutar. Good. And then the third part of the Mishnah, C, now this until now was only talking about Shiyah. Says C, just like they argue regarding Shiyah, pligi nami belachzir, they also argue about Chazara, which means Beit Shammai omrim notlin avalo machzirin. Beit Shammai says the only thing you're allowed to do is take it off but not return it. Meaning to say is, when it comes to Shiyah that requires gufa uktuma, that's only for Shiyah. But Chazara, says Beit Shammai, for sure it's not acceptable. Beit Hillel omrim af machzirin. And Beit Hillel says, not only can you use gufa uktuma for Shiyah, but you can even use gufa uktuma for Chazara. And this is like the Chachamim, and the Chachamim paskin like Beit Hillel. It's a beautiful way to read the Mishnah. Can we run through it outside for a minute?
I got it.
Yeah, let's run through it outside.
Because it's very confusing in the beginning, because then you say like, no, it's only about, according to Hanania, it's only about Chazara. According to Chachamim, it's Sheyah and Chazara.
Exactly. So good. Let's run through it for a second. So the first part of our Mishnah says, if you're fueling the oven with gefet veitzim, you need to do gufa uktuma. What is it? So according to the Chacham, it's a shehiyah. To leave the food on the fire before Shabbat, you need the tikkun of gufa uktuma. Next part of the Mishnah says, well, if you're leaving it on before Shabbat, what types of foods are allowed to use gufa uktuma? Mayim or even tavshil. And then this third part, C of the Mishnah, says, what about Chazara? So on that, Beit Shammai says, I only said, by the way, it's only for Mayim and it's only for Shiyah. That's regarding Mayim. But for Chazara, you're not allowed to Bichlal. Beit Hillel says, even for Chazara is mutar, and the Chachamim paskin like Beit Hillel. So therefore it comes out that both Shiyah and Chazara, you can use Gufa Uktuma because the Chachamim follow the position of Beit Hillel. One second, now we just did the Chachamim. But now let's see if Hananya fits in the Mishnah. Okay, so far we got the Chachamim fits beautiful. But if you want to read in the Mishnah, what's that?
It's like Bet Hillel then. Because
if you read the Mishnah like that, that's not how Hananya is going to read the Mishnah. Hold on.
Okay.
But if you say that Hananya is the author of the Mishnah, this is how you're going to have to read the Mishnah. Again, the beginning of the Mishnah says, Gufa Uktuma, you can put something on the oven. According to Hananya, that cannot be talking about Shehiyah, because he doesn't hold Shehiyah requires Gufa Uktuma. So the only thing the Reisha could be talking about is Lefi Hananya.
Chazara.
The only thing could be talking about is Chazara, because you don't need Gufa Uktuma for Shehiyah. So when it says Lo yitem lo yachzir et ha'ochel lekira, ela im ken he did Gufa Uktuma. So let's see that inside. That's how you're going to have to read A. That's how Hananya is going to have to read. Let's see. But if you want to read into the Mishnah Chazara, like Hananya is going to have to say, so this is how you have to read the Mishnah. Akira, the oven that was heated up with kashu gvava. Again, these things are not mosif hevel. So machzirein aleh tavshil. You could return the food on Shabbat, but begefet uveitzim lo yachzir ad sheyigof ad sheyiten efer. In order to return it, since it's mosif hevel, or it becomes cold. Either way, the point is, you need to do gufa uktumat in order to do chazara. Now, for shehiyah, you don't need gufa uktuma. You don't need it. This is what we're reading now, according to Hananya. Now, let's go to B. Okay, so now we had a machloket. What type of food requires gufa uktuma? Can you use the kula? Umay machzirin. Which foods can you use the leniency of gufa uktuma for chazara? So Beit Shammai omrim chamin avalot tavshil, only hot water, not cooked foods. Or Beit Hillel omrim chamin v'tavshil. Beit Hillel will say chamin and tavshil. You could return to the fire on Shabbat as long as you did gufa uktuma beforehand. So far, so good. The Reisha A is chazara, B is chazara. The problem is, what was the third part of the Mishnah? Bet Shammai Omrim, the next machloket, what? Bet Shammai Omrim, notlin avelo machzirin. That you could take food off the fire on Shabbat, but you can't return it to the fire. Now let's stop for a second. When he says, notlin avelo machzirin, right? What is he talking about, Bet
So
Shammai?
notlin only מים.
Avelo machzirin ma?
מים.
Lo machzirin
תבשיל.
tafshil. Because Bet Shammai holds machzirin mayim chamim.
לא. According to Hanania?
Vadai. How did Hanani understand the second clause? When does Gufa Uktuma help you for Chazara? So Bet Shammai says, Mak lemayim. Bet Hillel says, afilu letavshil.
So לא מחזיר.
So then in the Seifa, the third part of the Mishnah, Ein machzirin. What does Ein machzirin mean according to Bet Shammai? Ein machzirin.
Tafshil.
But mayim you are allowed to. Okay?
So מים, it's not a problem.
Okay.
No.
Ubeit Hillel omrim af machzirin. Now when Beit Hillel says af machzirin, what does he mean?
גם המים, גם
מים תבשיל. So the C is just repeating B. Everybody see that? There's no chidush in C that's not included in B.
What about תבשיל with מים?
Now, I want to show the clear. According to the Chachamim, it's not a kasha. Because according to the Chachamim, A and B are talking about Shiyah. C introduces Chazara. We didn't even talk about it before.
You spoke about
But according
מים.
to Hananya, whatever is discussed in C was already mentioned in B. Let's go through it again outside.
And
Make
if
sure
it's
we
tafshil
get
with
the
מים.
kasha very clear.
Tafshil
According,
shel
one
מים.
second, one second. According to Chachamim, Gefet Veitzim, you're not allowed to do Shihiyah unless you did Gufa Uktuma. That's according to the Chachamim. When are you allowed to use Gufa Uktuma for Shihiyah? So Beit Shammai says Zak Lemayim, Beit Hillel says Afilu Letavshil. And regarding Chazara, says see, Beit Shammai said you can't do Chazara, Beit Hillel holds you could do Chazara. That's a chidush we didn't talk about before. So according to the Chachamim,
Fits perfect.
beautiful, and they hold like Beit Hillel, so you could do Chazara or Shiyah as long as you did Gufa Uktuma. Beautiful. But according to Hananya, you already say in the Reisha that for Chazara, you need Gufa Uktuma. Then you discussed what types of foods are you allowed to use this Gufa Uktuma. Beit Shammai says only for water. Beit Hillel says even for Tavshil. So then the Seifa that says Ein Machzirin, Beit Shammai must mean Ein Machzirin Tavshil. But he already said that essentially. And Beit Hillel who says Machzirin, he means even Tavshil or water. But he already said you could be Machzirin if you did Gufa
No, maybe there is no-
Uktuma. So the third
Again,
part
I have a
becomes...
לא.
In the second part, we said, when is Gufa Uktuma going to help you for Chazara?
According to
According to Beit Shammai, for Mayim. According to Beit Hillel, Afilu Letavshil. So then what's the third part saying? Beit Shammai says, Ein Machzirin. Obviously, what does he mean?
אין מחזירים.
Tavshil. He must mean Tavshil, because water you could return, like we said in the in B.
תבשיל שהוא במים.
אבל לא,
One second.
אולי אין מחזירים מים, זה לא גור וכתום. זה קוראים לבית שמאי.
That's not what it says. We're talking about where it is Garuf Katum, the whole Mishnah. So Memele, it comes out that C is unnecessary.
According to Rabbi Hanania.
According to Hananya. So the Mishnah is more mashma like the Chachamim. And Memele, we have a raya that for even for Shiyah,
Tiyufta leRabbi Hanania?
Tiyufta leChananya. That's what it seems like.
no,
I'm not going to say Tiyufta because the
David.
Gemara doesn't say Tiyufta yet. So, but it is a kasha. Kasha against
Doesn't make any sense.
Hananya. So how does Hananya read the Mishnah? So what's the Gemara going to answer? It's going to say like this. There's you're not reading the Mishnah correctly according to Hananya. To read the Mishnah a little bit different. Okay? So let's see. So Hatulamali, the Gemara says, according to Hananya, Hatulam, what do we need the third part for? Okay, turning to Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. So the Gemara answers like this. Beautiful. Really, I'll tell you that you read the Mishnah, it's talking about Chazara like Hananya. Means there were words missing in the Mishnah. Means you read it straight, there's some line in between, we'll see, that you have to know in order to understand the
We're
Mishnah
missing
like
the salt and
Hananya.
pepper for the steak.
Yeah. Ba'achi katani. This is what the Mishnah really means to say. Now let's go slow. Kira she'sikua bekash uvigvava. This is the same. The first part of the Mishnah is if you heated it with kash uvigvava, it's not mosif hevel, machzirin ala tavshil. Machzirin. According to Hananya, machzirin, you could return it. You don't need gufa uktuma. Machzirin.
לא צריך
You don't,
לשייך.
for Shia, we're not even talking about that yet. Machzirin ala tavshil because it's not an issue of mosif hevel. You don't even need gufa uktuma. Begefet uveitzim, which is mosif hevel, and that's a problem of chazara, but lo yachse ad she'igof ad she'iten et ha'efer. You need to do gufa uktuma, and only then could you do chazara. Okay? That's exactly how we learned before, the first part. So it's talking about chazara. You need to do gufa uktuma for chazara. Beautiful. Now this is what we're adding in. Listen to this line. Ava lishhot, that was chazara. But lishhot, mash'in afal pi she'eno gavu ve'eno katum. You could leave it on before Shabbat, even if there wasn't gufa uktuma. Because who is this like? This is like Chananya. Chananya holds, for Shia, you don't even need gufa uktuma. Okay, we're just adding in that line.
So B'Sheiya, Chananya is mekel more than Bet Hillel.
Okay, yes. Chananya has to follow Beit Hillel. We'll see. Abelishot, mash'in afal pi she'eno garuf ve'eno katum. Now that we added in that line about Shia, what we're going to say is, the second section B, it's not talking about Chazara. It's actually talking about Shia. Let's see that inside. Umahen mashhin, this is what we're changing. Before we understood it, B follows A, so it has to be talking about Chazara. No! B follows the diuk of A. The first part of our Mishnah said you can't do Chazara unless you do gufa uktuma. The in between the lines, in between the words is, but Shia is allowed without gufa uktuma. Umahen mashin. Now that Shia that's permitted, what types of foods are permitted? Bet Shammai omrim chamina velo tavshil. Only with hot water, that's the type of shia that's mutar. But a cooked dish, you're not allowed to do shia with. Beit Hillel omrim chaminu v'tavshil. Now this is perfect. Chananya fits with Beit Hillel still, meaning shia is permitted without gufa uktuma for chamin and for tavshil. That's B. And now we added another sentence between B and C. Exactly. And according to Beit Shammai, just chamin. According to Beit Hillel, ben chamin, ben tavshil. Now, let's add another sentence here.
So what the B doing?
It's explaining to us what type of shia is the gamri mutar, without gufa uktuma. Again, like this. The first part of the Mishnah says chazara. In order to do chazara, you need gufa uktuma. But shia, that's the sentence we're adding in. Aval shia, lo tzarich gufa, lo tzarich ktuma. Ve'eze shia mutar, bli gufa uktuma. Beit Shammai אומרים רק למים חמים, Beit Hillel אומרים אפילו לתבשיל. So now we're talking about shia.
But shia, we do need gufa uktuma.
According to Chananya, you don't need gufa uktuma for shia. And Chananya follows Beit Hillel. This is beautiful.
But how? Because Beit Hillel do need, say, they didn't overflow.
But let's finish the sentence. I'll go over it outside. Hold on. Now, between B and C, V'hach chazara da'ami lecha. But this chazara that we spoke about in the first part of the Mishnah, lav divrei akoli. The third part of the Mishnah says, you're telling me gufa uktuma is enough for chazara? The third part of the Mishnah says it's not so simple. Actually, that's a machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Ela machloket Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Shebeit Shammai omrim notlin velo machzirin. You're not allowed to do chazara. That's what the third part's saying. Beit Hillel omrim af machzirin. And Beit Hillel says you can even do chazara. Now, lefi this, the way we're reading it now, comes out that it's talking about A is chazara, B is shia, C is chazara. And now it comes out, Chananya fits beautiful, like Beit Hillel.
Again.
Let's go through it now. Let's go through it outside before we're going to stop here, but let's go through this outside. According to the Chachamim, we have the reading clear. Should we go over it again? The Chachamim, the Mishnah starts off and says, Lo yiten, you're not allowed to do shihiyah unless you have gufa uktuma.
Lo yiten shihiyah.
Lo yishe means you're not allowed to do gufa, you're not allowed to do shihiyah unless you had the oven was gufa uktuma before Shabbat. That's the first part of our Mishnah. B, when is it, what type of food is it permitted to use this tikkun of gufa uktuma for shiyah? So, just water? Or even tavshil? C,
that's according to Chachamim.
This is a Chachamim. C, this was only discussing until now shiyah. Regarding chazara, we have a machloket, which is that Beit Shammai say, Bichlal you can't do chazara. Beit Hillel says you can even use the tikkun of gufa uktuma for chazara.
Beit Shammai can't do anything?
Can't do chazara.
Anything. No tafshil velo.
And it comes out that Beit Hillel holds you can do gufa uktuma for both. For both. And it comes out the Chachamim rely like Beit Hillel. Perfect. They fit perfect like Beit Hillel. This is a very simple way to read the Mishnah. Very straight. מאוד פשוט.
Sounds more simple.
מאוד
also.
פשוט. According to Hananya, the Chasei Mechzera says like this. The first part of a Mishnah has to be talking about Chazara, because it says you need to do Gufa Ktuma. Well, what type of Gufa Ktuma are we talking about? We're talking about Chazara, because according to him, Shehiyah does not require Gufa Ktuma. So it says in the Mishnah, you're not allowed to put food. What it really means is, Lo Yachzir Ochel Lakira,
does not require Gufa.
unless you did Gufa Ktuma.
להחזור לקרירה, להחזיר, חזרה.
Ken, you can't do Chazara on Shabbat unless you did Gufa Uktuma. That's the real. That's A.
They're calling to...
Hananya.
הסדר פה שונה.
כן. that's אומר חזרה.
זה היה שהייה חזרה, עכשיו זה נהיה חזרה, שהייה חזרה.
שהייה חזרה.
כן.
You're not allowed to do chazara unless you did gufa uktuma. Shia, this is the line in between. Shia bichlal does not require gufa uktuma.
Okay.
So we're saying in between, that's between A and B. What we're doing is we're fitting in, there's, like, you know, you read the newspaper, there's the information between the lines. That's what it is here. Between A and B, gufa, סליחה.
רק דחזון עובדיה, מותר, inside it אסור.
So, Chazara requires gufa uktuma. But, one second, hello. But Shia does not require gufa uktuma. That's the, between A and B. Shia, now that you're talking about Shia, B comes along and says, what does it mean? Shia does not require gufa uktuma. So says Beit Shammai, it's only for water that Shia is permitted. It doesn't require gufa. But even for tavshil, you don't need gufa uktuma to do Shia. Oh.
That's the difference between Chachamim and Hananya.
Shia. Moving on to C, by the way, the Chazara we spoke about in A, it's not l'divrei hakol. Because Beit Shammai holds, even with gufa uktuma, you're not allowed to do chazara.
Beit Shammai.
Beit Shammai says, "Ein machzirin afilu im gufa uktuma, ein machzirin."
None.
Okay, can't do.
No water, no tafshil.
And Beit Hillel says, "You could be machzirin."
Both.
Both.
Big difference.
So now it comes out the way Hananya reads the Mishnah is he holds like Beit Hillel. You can do chazara if you use gufa uktuma. For everything.
Beit Shammai, Mayim, Beit
And the
Hillel.
Hananya, he holds like Beit Hillel, is that you can do chazara if you do gufa uktuma. For Shehiyah, they both have to hold like Beit Hillel because
Yes.
Beit Hillel is we paskin like Beit Hillel.
Yes.
But they interpret Beit Hillel differently. That's the point. According to Hananya, Beit Hillel holds that for chazara you need gufa uktuma. According to Hananya,
Again, it goes
לפי חנניה, בית הלל סוברים שאתה צריך גופה כתומה רק לחזרה, אבל לשהייה לא צריך גופה כתומה. והוא סובר כבית שמאי.
שהייה,
כבית
מים,
הלל, סליחה.
תבשיל, לא גרוע ולא כתום, אין בעיה.
כן.
כל האישו, קודם חנניה, כל האישו, the way explained בית הלל, it's בחזרה.
Exactly.
חזרה לדבר שהוא מים, לא צריך שיהיה כתום וגרוע, ולגבי תבשיל צריך שיהיה גרוע וכתום. קודם רבי חנניה, that explained בית הלל. שהייה אין בעיה בכלל. גם מים, גם תבשיל, לא גרוע ולא כתום, אין בעיה. כל האישו זה רק בחזרה.
כן.
מה האישו?
צריך גופה כתומה.
במה?
בחזרה, דווקא בחזרה.
וגם במים, גם בתבשיל.
בכל מקרה.
בחזרה יש את העניין. שהייה אין לו בעיה.
זה מאוד black and white, very black and white here. It's not, that's how we're coming out, like Beit Hillel. And the Chachamim say, no. Chachamim say that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, they're arguing. But what are they arguing? That Beit Hillel holds both for Shehiyah and for Chazara. Beit Shammai is in the Mishnah, but the Chachamim have to hold like Beit Hillel. That's the point.
Yes.
So the Chachamim hold that Beit Hillel holds even for Shehiyah, Gufa Uktuma is necessary. Afil l'Shehiyah. So that's what comes out the difference between them. You hear the difference?
חנניה לא צריך שהייה, שהייה לא צריך גרוף כתום, חכמים צריך גרוף כתום בשביל שהייה.
But that's what it comes out.
And also to
Chachamim hold that Beit Hillel
חזרה,
doesn't
אין
need
מחזירים.
Gufa Uktuma for Shehiyah. חנניה סובר
לא צריך שהייה.
שלא צריך גופה כתומה לפי בית הלל בשהייה, והוא סובר כבית הלל.
ו-also, there is another difference.
אבל חכמים סוברים שבית הלל סוברים שאתה צריך גם לשהייה גופה כתומה.
There is two differences, רבא.
אז המחלוקת היא בעצם מה השיטה של בית הלל.
There is two difference.
זה המחלוקת.
But there is two difference here.
So we have two ways to read the Mishnah now, and we're going to stop here at this. We're going to go to more proofs tomorrow, but everybody...
I think I got it, but let me...
Hashem, so far so good.
Tell me if it's correct. There is two difference.
Yeah.
According to Chachamim, okay, for Sheiya, it has to be Garuf Katum. According to Hanania, okay...
אפילו לשיעה, that's the way to say it. אפילו לשיעה.
בסדר, according to Hanania,
אפילו לשיעה.
there is no need for Garuf Katum for Sheiya.
Exactly.
חזרה, according to חכמים, בית שמאי פוסקין, אי אפשר להחזיר. בית הלל, you can מחזיר.
כן.
you can מחזיר.
עם גרופה וכתומה.
גרוף וכתום.
כן.
according to חנניה, okay, בית שמאי allowed to return water, and בית הלל allowed to return תבשיל. This is the two differences?
Yes, but the main point is, very important, the main point is that Hananya holds Beit Hillel does not require
Garuf v'katum for Sheiya.
Exactly. That's the major chiddush.
According to Beit Hillel,
you don't need Gufa Uktuma for Sheiya.
And
the Chachamim hold you do need Gufa Uktuma for Sheiya also.
אבל לא מדבר על what kind of tafshil, we don't get to it.
That's meaning it's not Nogeya, meaning the point is according to, Tachlis, that's what we're saying, Tachlis, what comes out. Is what comes out is...
Any Sheiya of tafshil, according to Chachamim, no need. According to Chazal, any Sheiya of tafshil, chayav Garuf v'katum.
Lefi Beit Hillel also, exactly. That's exactly it. That's what comes out.
Again, Chachamim, Garuf v'katum.
מה סוברים בית הלל? מה סוברים בית הלל?
according to חכמים גרוף וכתום for Sheiya,
חייב.
אלה מחזירים בחזרה בית הלל, בית שמאי, בית הלל מותר. חנניה, Sheiya, don't need גרוף וכתום, חזרה, מותר, according to בית שמאי, מותר מים, בית הלל מותר תבשיל.
Sat Hashem, we'll stop here. Tashma. We'll go to the next proof tomorrow, but we're trying to prove which of these two shitot, Hanani v'Chachamim, are more accurate. That's what we're trying to go. We'll stop at the top of Amid Zayin Amud.
But the main thing according to Hanani is the Sheiya.